Hi Dragons! This is part 2 of lecture 2. So we were talking about the Native Americans, and so the Trail of Tears. The United States government decided to set up a tribal system we still have today, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs sets up a governmental system. Mind you, they already had a governmental system, but they didn't have the United States governmental system. So the United States set up a governmental system that looked very much like the United States system, with a leader and different representatives, a Senate, a House, and representatives. They had a constitution, and they were incorporated into the United States, and they have their own system of laws as well. So they moved everybody west and set up areas where they could live. And that worked fine until they discovered gold and other minerals and other things that were of value. The United States thought they were putting them on land that was not valuable. And so then they broke their first treaties, okay? So that set up a system of mistrust. Now, again, I do want to emphasize that I'm not picking on the United States government, because other places did too. When I went to South Africa last semester, and I saw what the South African government did to the African people who were there, the black settlers, the black natives, okay? What they did was the South Africans said, wow, look at this prime real estate, okay? And they moved them off. And to this day, they're living in deplorable conditions, shanty towns that are not very sanitary and don't have much of anything. It's just, it's terrible. And, you know, the same thing is happening with Native Americans today as well. So when they found gold in the West and things like that, they also had to, you know, get them away from there. So they tried to buy the territory from them. Like, oh, we moved you here. But now, you know, we found gold, so we want to buy the territory from you. And a lot of the native groups were like, no, why are you trying to buy the land from us, okay? So they tried, and then the government just said, okay, well, we'll just take it. You're not going to sell to us, so we'll just take it. So they appealed for protection. This is the Cherokees. Let's use that example. They appealed for protection, and President Jackson said no, and then made the Indian Removal Act of 1830 to force them, you know, from their land. And the United States Supreme Court said that the United States government was unconstitutional, but the president said, we're just going to ignore what the Supreme Court says. So, you know, the corruption was seen early on. I know every generation thinks this is the most corrupt government we've ever had in the United States. The United States always outdoes itself and says, no, just watch this. So yeah, those people at the time who disagreed were assassinated. So you know, you saw the forcible removal of people from the East Coast, especially the Cherokees. Like I told you, only a few remained, and they marched them 800 miles. Along the way, about 4,000 people died, so that's why it's called the Trail of Tears. So the Army divided the people into 13 different groups to make it more manageable, and they were paid $65 for each person in their care, and so it didn't always go for, you know, the care of the people. Okay, some went by land, some went by rivers, and those traveling by water, 311 died when their boats capsized, things like that. And then they had an outbreak of cholera, which is a really horrible infectious disease. And out of a detachment of 800, only 489 survived. So by the 1850s, there were scattered groups of people, or before they occupied the entire United States. And this was seen over and over again in all these different tribes, okay? So what really defeated the Native Americans was the loss of their habitat, the loss of hunting, attrition. The white people came in and they killed for sport, which is something they did not do. They killed to survive. So they found themselves hemmed in by miners, by gold miners, things like that, by hunters. and they were dying by farmers, and they were dying because of European diseases that they had never encountered, substandard and inadequate housing and subsistence living, pushed to the exhaustion by cold and disease, and then they were in reservations by the 1890s. So a sad kind of legacy that happened with the Native Americans. And the Native Americans today are still living in abject poverty with the highest rates of death and morbidity and mortality as well. See, that's where the history of public health systems come in to play. And they are also plagued by addictions and things like that, poor health, okay? Which, by the way, a friend of mine who is, she graduated from medical school and she had over $100,000 in debt. And she signed up to be a doctor on a native reservation. And they give you, so she signed up for 4 years, and every year they'd wipe out a year of debt for her. And they gave her a house and a living, like food and whatever, and a vehicle, and a small salary. I think she made like $25,000 a year, but she's out on a reservation. Had all of her basic needs taken care of, so it was just a little bit of money. But there's programs like that exist for you if when you graduate from college and you find yourself in debt and you want to give back. That's a way to help you do that, and you're giving back of your time and talent, okay? So let's move on to slavery, which slavery all over the world, it occurs all over the world still to this day, okay? So, but slavery in the United States is a big stain on American history. As a matter of fact, when I was in Germany, I have a friend in Germany. She's the mayor of a town in Germany, and Toledo's sister city. She and I were talking one day, and I asked her, what do you teach in your history books about Hitler? What is it that you do for the education of your youth? And she looked at me and said in a rather defensive way, which I don't blame her. She said, "Well, what do you guys teach about Native Americans and about African Americans?" Point taken. So, slavery happens all over the world, and it's not just associated with skin pigmentation. There have been slaves that were Caucasian, owned by other Caucasians still to this day. So, but in the United States, again, with that mentality of we'll go in and we'll take what we want, it had cash crops, tobacco, cotton, that needed workers, and so settlers went over to Africa and said, hey, this is going to work. We're going to take these people and we're going to move them over to the United States, and you're going to be our slaves who will work for free and do our bidding. And so the tobacco was the first crop. It's very labor intensive, so they really needed people to work on it, and God forbid you pay anyone to do an honest day's work. But at first the Native Americans, they tried doing it with the Native Americans, but they ran away from the plantations, and they weren't having it, and they were coerced to the point of death. So the plantation owners decided, we're just killing them, and we're not getting any work done. So that's when they decided to go to Africa. They also tried to do indentured servitude, where we'll give you a place in the United States, and we'll house you, we'll give you food, you work for us for a matter of X number of years, and then you'll have your freedom. But England had a system known as poor laws, and you could sell themselves in your service for 4 to 7 years. They received no pay. The master provided their keep. They were supposed to be given 50 acres of land when that was over. But most often the free land that came with that was land that no one wanted, swamp land, unfarmable land, things like that, And so that was difficult. Some of the problems they encountered was a high rate of disease because they had poor sanitation, okay? So you see how health and history and violence and aggression, all of it is combined together. We shouldn't think of these as separate things. These are things that happened as a result of X, Y, and Z, and it's a holistic problem, okay? So it was appalling. I mean, 80% were sick due to things like malaria, which, was rampant at the time in Africa, still is. It is the #1 killer of all of us worldwide ever in history. Typhoid, overwork, malnutrition, bad treatment, Okay, all of those things took a toll on the population of their slaves. So there were always power struggles. Always, always, always power struggles. And again, not trying to pick on the United States, also true all over the world. When you try and enslave a population, they kind of don't like it. Okay? So the first Africans were purchased in Jamestown in 1619. Initially, they were treating them like indentured servants, but they didn't speak English. Communication was a barrier. They didn't know they didn't know the laws. They didn't speak English. That was a barrier, and they didn't know when their indentured servitude was up. So then they were kept in bondage for their whole lives. Okay, so much for indentured servitude, right? And it also became the custom where you kept not only them, but their families and their children. And so, it just became an unmanageable cycle trying to get to freedom. So this became custom. This became the regular way of doing things, standard operating procedure. In 1664, Maryland took the last step, declaring that all Negroes would be slaves for life, and their children would be slaves forever. So that was the final nail in the coffin, quite literally. So there you go. With the improvements of business and economy in England, the system of indentured servitude in England was on the decline. So to meet the demands for the workers in the colonies, they increasingly relied on the slave trade. Okay, so slaves were 7% of the population in 1680, and then more than 40% by the middle of the 18th century, and they were used to, meet the economic needs of the tobacco industry and then the cotton industry. Okay, but pretty soon groups started to arise of abolitionists in states like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and things like that, where there was a high number of religious groups. So by the end of the 18th century, 90% of all the slaves were now in the southern states. Okay, and slavery in the South was an unstable system. Okay, the United States was talking the talk on fairness and equality, and clearly slaves were not equal. And Southerners were always afraid of slave uprising. And number two, the slaves weren't happy about it either. Okay, and slave productivity was also inefficient, very inefficient. So there were always plots that were real or imagined. Okay, so there's where that whole mythology comes in. So there was a Nat Turner rebellion, and I have a video in there for you to watch it. It was a resistance to slavery, and abolition became a northern phenomenon. Okay, so all of this is the build-up to the Civil War. Okay, so in the South, instead of having a conversation and deciding, we're going to have a conversation about this, the Southerners, especially the plantation owners, decided they were just going to tighten the reins and make it even more restrictive. And what we saw was an appearance of things like lynching and beatings and whippings. So yeah, we ended up having a lot of discontent, sowing the seeds of discontent, and race hatred led to a lot of atrocities that were happening. And Lincoln in 1863 decided to have the Emancipation Proclamation, and black soldiers started to serve in the Union Army. Okay, so we saw a lot of outbursts in the Civil War, and a lot of things happened in New York City with the draft riots, and there's a little video footage there for you to watch about that. Something that is not really talked about, or it's kind of an unforgotten. It's a forgotten piece of American history. Okay, Congress passed the Enrollment Act of 1863 and made military service mandatory with liability if you didn't. So please watch that video of the New York City draft riots. I'm going to go on to part 3.